In today's set reading, we've skipped ahead from where we were last week with Zacchaeus to Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem, the mass adulation of the crowd, and then the beginnings of the final chapter as Jesus is challenged by the religious authorities and ultimately, of course, condemned to murder by them. So this particular section of Luke's Gospel, in common with Matthew and Mark, contains the material about Jesus going to a temple, or the temple, and being challenged in three separate ways by three separate groups. Firstly, by the chief priests and the teachers of the law, who simply ask him, "What right have you got to do these things?" And Jesus tells the parable of the tenants in the vineyard, which is a stinging retort about the idea of being entrusted with greatness and goodness and having done nothing with it. In fact, squandering it, challenging the true owner, killing the owner's son, and a metaphor there. Then we have the chief priests recruiting some people who try to trick Jesus with a legalistic question about paying taxes. And then finally, we have a challenge from the religious elite, the group that we call the Sadducees, who are stereotypically characterized by being a group who didn't believe in the resurrection. And so when Jesus talks about being raised after being put to death and the new life with God beyond, that's a sort of theological sticking point for them. They were a traditionalist sect, the religious elite, and the chief priest would often come from that sect too. So this is Luke chapter 20 and verses 27 to 38. Then some Sadducees, who say that people will not rise from death, came to Jesus and said, "Teacher, Moses wrote this law for us. If a man dies and leaves a wife but no children, that man's brother must marry the widow, so that they can have children who will be considered the dead man's children. Once there were 7 brothers. The eldest got married and died without having children. Then the second one married the woman, and then the third. The same thing happened to all 7. They died without having children. Last of all, the woman died. Now on the day when the dead rise to life, whose wife will she be? All 7 of them had married her." Jesus answered them, "The men and women of this age marry, but the men and women who are worthy to rise from death and live in the age to come will not then marry. They will be like angels and cannot die. They are the sons of God because they have risen from death. And Moses clearly proves that the dead are raised to life. In the passage about the burning bush, he speaks of the Lord as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is the God of the living, not of the dead. For to him all are alive." So it's an interesting theological question that the Sadducees pose to Jesus. And he talks to them about how their question is just nonsense, because in the age to come, now so much definition is needed here, when we talk about the end of this physical life, it's not going to be the same. Jesus says, well, the people of that age, they won't marry because they'll be immortal. Now, that doesn't mean that they're going to walk around in the same bodies as we have now, that we're going to experience things through the way we do now, sight and touch and smell and sound. We don't know what it will be like, but the one thing we do know, beyond any doubt, is that we will be more fully with the God who made us and the God who, if we're lucky enough, we experience in this life. But the new life, the life when this physical life on this earth ends, will be so completely different to the one we have now. In terms of thinking about death from a non-religious perspective, people often use the analogy, perhaps, of a child in utero. For when a fetus is growing in a mother's womb, its experience of life is very different from the life out here in the real world. For that child, there are muffled sounds, there is a sense of light, perhaps, but certainly no sight. The concept of running and jumping and leaping are completely and utterly alien. And yet, when that child is born and grows up, all those things become normal and real. And so the transition between being in a mother's womb to real life, a transition characterized by being separated by just a few millimeters of flesh, is so completely and utterly different. It's so utterly different. And so it is, one might assume, with the way the transition between living in this world and not being alive anymore, not being in this physical world. We don't know what it's going to be like. Nobody's been there and come back and told us. And to a very large extent, it's fruitless and irrelevant to ask. We cannot know what it's like. But for those of us who've experienced God in our lives as a real force, as a God with whom we have a living, vibrant relationship, one thing is totally and utterly true, and that is that there is no way that that relationship will ever end. In this life, I may experience God, the God who made all things, through the love that I feel in my heart that God has put there. I may feel the joy and the utter amazement that that pure, beautiful love has found me. But that's using human emotions. I may cry, I may be welled up with tears, I may be blown away, I may be shocked, I may be in total awe, but these are human physical reactions. Post this life, my experience of that same God will no doubt be completely and utterly different. Jesus says to the Sadducees, the people of that future age will not marry because they'll be immortal. God is a God for all times. And so when, yes, he speaks to Moses and says, I am the God of all your ancestors, it doesn't mean I was their God and now I'm not anymore. They are still in communion with me. And of course, there are great theological ways in which the different gospel writers try to get that across. You'll remember in John's gospel, the rising of Lazarus, and the fact that he calls to him in his state of being dead, Lazarus, come out, and Lazarus hears and responds and comes out, is again John's way perhaps of saying that, it doesn't matter. God is always with you in this life or the next. And that's what we understand. And this is the sure and firm foundation of our lives and the source of all our joy, to understand that that is the relationship we are in. It takes away all that fear of death, because ultimately, of course, the relationship we have now with God, of course it will persist, but we don't know what it's going to be like. Another silly example perhaps would be if you're taken on holiday by somebody and they say, oh, well, we'll go to France and we'll go to the beach and we'll go to see the Louvre and we'll go up the Eiffel Tower. Now, you don't actually know what any of that's going to be like. The beach could be a gloriously sunny day, or it could be a howling gale. You may buy an ice cream, or you may buy fish and chips, or whatever people have in France. And your experience of going up the Eiffel Tower might be beautifully wonderful, or it may be a real horror. So you just don't know, but you know the basics. And we know the basics too, that when this life ends, we are still with God. It is utterly, utterly inconceivable that the love that has found us in this life should not persist in some form, in some way, when this life ends. Because consciousness and reality, as we know in this life, are things we experience. But the true nature of what is reality from a quantum physics perspective is very shaky indeed. And our own perspective of what is true is also completely shaky. For everyone who feels solidly grounded to the earth and experiences that Newtonian gravity that they feel, a force drawing you towards the centre of the earth. Well, we know that's not really what's happening at all. It's what it feels like, but it's not actually what's happening. To realise that we are, in fact, sitting on a rotating ball of rock, hurtling through space at enormous speeds, in the vastness, emptiness of space, is not what we perceive and experience as we travel to work, as we go about our daily lives. If we really understood what was happening to us, we'd all go absolutely crazy. So we're pretty good at having illusions and different senses of what is reality already. So it shouldn't surprise us that we aren't necessarily completely in control of understanding what will happen when this life ends. So Jesus's passage here and the message to everyone is that, yes, God is God forever. And there is a great sense of joy in that.